Hello. Welcome to a foreword. For anyone who doesn't know me, I am Thomas. Hi, how are you? And I recently had most of my teeth removed. And I'm wearing dentures. It sucks. But I'm learning to speak again. Part of that learning to speak, unfortunately, is speaking aloud. But since I live alone, and reading aloud alone in your room is one step away from psychotic breakdown, I decided that I'm going to read an audio version of a book. But I can't do that with anyone whose work anyone else would read, so I'm doing my own. I'm going to do at least one a week, I hope. At least maybe two, depending on the size of the chapters, but I'm rewriting it as I go. So I have to rewrite it before I can actually read it on here. So this is going to be an interesting timetable, but I want to keep it going. So, this is Wytiko. It's my story. It's 200 pages long as of right now, but as I rewrite it, it's going to grow. And we're going to do chapter by chapter. So, hope you enjoy it. If not, well, I mean, it's the best I could do. So, I guess that's all you need to know about this. So, hope you enjoy it. If not, I'm sorry for wasting your time. Hopefully I didn't waste too much of it. So, yeah, here's Wytiko. Breathtaking. This was the thought that swam through Thomas Dearborn's mind as he cleared the tree line and came out on the veranda his grandfather had shown him nearly 30 years ago. It hadn't changed. The view was awe-inspiring as ever. Some words fell short of their intended meanings and often get muddied into redundancy with overuse. The view that greeted him as he pulled around the final curve and came upon the dirt parking area that gave way to the fabulous vista of the nature beyond still had the power to take one's breath away, literally, until the subconscious mind reasserted itself and took back the function of breathing. This late in the season, there wasn't a single car here to spoil the effect, and he took it in with the same wonder he had as a boy. The parking lot itself was merely a dirt square bordered by fallen trees and oversized branches. No blacktop, no painted spots. While it was nature bullied into the service of man, it still felt natural, and that was the important thing. Beyond the wooden border was a cultivated space of about 5 yards before the real woods took over. Trees that had seen more summers than could be counted ran this way and that, but a natural cut in the forest lent itself to a picturesque view of the mountain trails leading down to the lake, which, in the fiery light of the rapidly setting sun, glinted like molten lava. A few flags tied to trees marked well-worn trails leading down to the lake and up to some of the higher elevations. The tent area Thomas meant to use was on the other side of the road, beyond the trees in the secluded glen that was an easy walk back to the SUV, but it's curtained from the road completely by trees. Perfect. He parked the vehicle and took a step out. He paused briefly and sucked in a deep draught of chilly air and let it out slowly, seeing the wisp of his exhalation curl around in a miniature cyclone before disappearing inches from his face. It was cold here at night, but not too bad. By the time the sun fled behind the curtain of the mountain range across the lake, he would have a fire going and tents erected. Besides, it was still only the 1st of September, and the real chill of the northern woods was still many days away. He turned and looked into the middle seats of the SUV, hoping to see the light of wonder that he had experienced in this exact moment when his grandfather had first brought him to this place more than 30 years ago on the faces of his own children. He wanted them to see him as he had first seen his grandfather, silhouetted by the setting sun and the majesty of the woods. He wanted them to share this moment, to feel small in the face of nature's grandeur, and to feel as he did at that moment all those years ago when the one who led him here shared and instilled within him the secret of the magic of nature. Unfortunately, neither of his children were even looking up at the moment. Jonathan was 11, and his sister Sophie was 13. His son was looking down at his Game Boy, which he had insisted on bringing and had buried his face in the entire ride. These days he couldn't seem to sit still, no matter in a car, restaurant, or even in the movies without the thing. It bordered on addiction, and that troubled Thomas in an odd, indistinct way. It was fully charged in the car on the way here as he played, keeping every precious erg of energy to keep boredom at bay when he got to the dire destination, an alien world with no electrical outlets to power his distractions. The boy shared his darker skin tone and jet black hair with his father, a genetic chain that was both frightening and satisfying. Just about everything else about him came straight from his mother's side. The restlessness, the odd way his focus leapt from subject to subject like a grasshopper who had drunk a latte. Except for video games, of course. He could stare at those for hours. He wore a Spider-Man shirt and blue jeans. Sophie was staring at her phone with her large eyes. Her hair was dark as well and braided into 2 pigtails, which Thomas suddenly thought was his wife's idea of irony, which sometimes crept over the line of good taste and seemed almost cruel. These instances were rare, but they did happen, especially when she didn't agree with what was happening. Sophie looked a little bit like an Indian girl from a movie in the 50s. All she was missing was a feather and a headband. His wife might have thought it a clever little joke, but it irritated him all of a sudden. He loved his wife, but when they were at odds on any given subject, she could be so subtly mean. Sophie had a miserable look on her small features. The pair of them looked like prisoners on the bus to Shawshank Penitentiary, and right now both of them were probably regretting that they were his children. Thomas sighed heavily, but put on a brave face, exclaiming, "We're here!" in a cheerful voice that sounded as genuine as a $3 bill in his own ears. "Yippee!" Jonathan said sardonically. He didn't even look up. Neither of them did. "Let's go, guys," Thomas said again, trying to keep the peace, if only for the first 10 minutes of the time here. "Where's the motel?" Sophie said. "Where will we sleep?" "Sophie, we packed tents. We're camping. Didn't you notice all the gear on the back?" She looked over her shoulder, then back at her father. "I thought we were cooking out and stuff." "Well, we are," he said, trying to hide his anger at her. How the hell did she not notice all of the gear, or forget the fact that they discussed all of this off and on since he had proposed this little outing last month? He closed his eyes, prayed for patience, and went on. "We're roughing it, Sophie. We'll cook our meals over a roaring fire and catch some fish, and we can eat those for breakfast before hiking around and enjoying nature. It'll be great." "Wait, eat fish that we caught? Like live fish?" "Well, we won't eat them live. We'll clean them and cook them, kiddo." "I won't eat them. That's disgusting." "Sophie, you love fish. We had salmon steaks last night." "That's different. They weren't alive." Jonathan let out, under his breath, a chortle at that. "You don't have to eat fish if you don't want to. No one will force you," Thomas assured her. "Let's go, kids. We need to set up camp before nightfall." They both shut down their devices and opened the doors, stepping out of the car into reality. "It's freezing," Sophie complained immediately. "It's 70 degrees, Sophie," Thomas said, and began to have serious doubts about his own intelligence for not seeing how this trip would turn out. "It's 68 degrees, Dad. The car has a thermometer right on the dash." So it's not 70. It's freezing." "Oh, for God's sake, Sophie. The house thermostat said it's 68 degrees all summer." She looked puzzled for a second, then theatrically grabbed both elbows and repeated, "It's freezing." Thomas turned back and walked to the back of the SUV without answering. The exchange had actually angered him. She could be so much like her mother. He opened the back door and pulled out the camping gear. Jonathan had his Game Boy back out and was playing. Sophie had kept her elbows in a state of psychosomatic frostbite. No help there. But the gear was manageable. He shouldered one tent and took the other under his arm. He then managed to grab the bag with all the miscellaneous bric-a-brac and closed the back of the car. He would have to come back for the food coolers after setting up camp. "Follow me," he said a little breathlessly, and walked towards the trees. It was a short trail, and when he stepped out into it, he was met with a pleasant surprise. A group of deer, a doe, 2 little ones, and a male with spectacular antlers, had been munching on the border of the trees and froze when they saw him emerge. For a moment, time stood still, as each of them looked at each other in frozen surprise. He heard his son coming and whispered his name, hoping to show his son the animals as they were before they fled the human intrusion in their meal. "Jonathan." Jonathan's nose came up from his electronic fantasy and stopped short. His eyes widened and a genuine grin spread across his face. "That's more like it," Thomas thought. At that moment, Sophie, her eyes down on her phone, walked right into his back and rebounded straight onto her ass with a loud thwomp. She let out a startled screech and sent the deer bounding into the forest. She probably didn't even see them. Her face went from pouty to angry in a millisecond. "Dad!" she yelled, and Thomas winced as he heard the flock of birds follow the deer's example and retreated before the shattered quiet of this place. "John pushed me." "I did not," her brother yelled back in a righteous, incredulous voice, all sense of wonder and joy quickly evaporating from the face of the accusation. "She walked into me." They fell to squabbling, culminating in many did not and did tos, and Thomas sighed again and separated them, offering up a silent apology to his grandfather. The old man had died just a month ago at 89 years old. He had outlived both of his children, Thomas, his father and aunt, by almost a decade. Thomas's father had died of a heart attack when he had only been 54 years old, a heavy smoker who had lived nothing better than a well-done steak. His odds had been bad from the outset. Thomas had himself been 27 at the time, and his grandfather had been one to help him through the worst of the grief. They had always been close, especially since his father had not been the most demonstrative of men. There had been love, of course, fierce love, but it was also largely unexpressed. He had even been that way with Thomas's mother, and upon reflection he doubted if he had ever heard the old man say, "I love you" to his mother more than a dozen times in his life. To his father, it was obvious he loved them, so why waste time expositing on the fact? It was one of the few things that Thomas Dearborn absolutely disagreed with when it came to his own father. It has been his grandfather's dying wish that his grandchildren be shown the land and of their ancestors, to try to show them a little bit of the world that they had belonged to and the people that they had lived here as one with the land that they had been blessed to walk upon. It was not going well. First off, their mother was against the idea from the very moment Thomas broached the subject. For once, though, he had put his foot down. Joanna was definitely the one who ruled the house, but just this once he dusted off his spine and used it. His steadfast, almost mulish insistence had, if nothing else, bemused her, and to her credit she relented, but not without a waspish comment that he had no idea what he was getting himself into. At this moment, the fact that she was probably right rankled him more than a little. She herself had decided to sit this one out, which was fine with him. This was a time to show his children their true heritage, and her comments and attitude would absolutely undermine his attempt at this. Joanna was a wonderful mother, a patient and loving wife, but she was so stubborn and gave absolutely no thought to ancestry or heritage. She was a hodgepodge of European blood thrown into a pot and left to simmer over into his beautiful, albeit trying at times, wife. He, on the other hand, was almost pure Ute Indian, and though the years had tempered his resolve on the subject, he was proud of his heritage and his people. When the world was new, these mountains were his birthright, and he wanted to share some of that pride, some of the heritage, with his children. In a perfect world, perhaps. In this one, his children were sulking, and he was losing daylight. He abandoned his attempt at inspiring awe in them and went about setting up first their tent, then his. They peppered him with questions as he went about his business, which was good, but the subjects of said questions had nothing to do with what he wanted them to ask him about. Instead of asking about what it felt like to hunt animals and fish in the lake and listen to elders tell tales of culture heroes long gone and of deities long forgotten, he was inundated with questions about why his daughter's cell phone wouldn't work and where his son could plug in his Game Boy when the batteries died. Thomas sighed yet again, outwardly this time, and he could almost see his wife's face shaking her head in his folly. Once the tents were set and the sleeping bags were set up, he traipsed back to the car and brought back the food. He set about making a decent-sized fire and then watched as it slowly gained strength. The fire pit was large and ringed with logs to sit on, the bark worn off long ago by countless asses sitting upon them. His children finally settled down around the fire, and he got their dinner out. Hot dogs on a stick. Yes, this was indeed the meal of his ancestors, attributed of hunts long ago by devouring the processed meat of pigs that had never run free in their poor, pathetic lives. Forgive me, grandfather, he thought again, looking up into the billowing clouds of smoke his fire had sent into the night sky. Occasionally sparks flew up into the night, dying embers carried aloft by waves of heat before expiring and falling back to earth. The night was so clear here, so incredibly beautiful, that for a moment he was 6 years old again, staring at the cornucopia of celestial bodies with unwavering awe, listening to his grandfather spinning the tales of Atansik, the mother of humanity, stories of Baguks and Boogies and Cheppy and the false faces in the woods, the trickster and the crows. He had sat wide-eyed and absorbed them all eagerly at his grandfather's name. He doubted that he could recount the tales as well as his grandfather, and even if he could, he doubted his children would possess the attention span to listen to them for more than a few minutes. It wasn't their fault, he knew, but a symptom of the age. Although when you discuss the behavior of generations using the same terms that you do in illness, maybe there was something wrong after all. Dad? Back to Earth. Yes, Jonathan? When are we going back to the car? We have been here a little over an hour, son. Why do you want to go home so badly? His son gave him a look that had, "Are you kidding me?" plastered all over it, but it was his daughter that answered. Because it's cold? Sophie said, like cold was something new and awful and in need of extinction, but he didn't want to return to that debate again either. And I can't text my friends, and there's no computer or TV or anything. She was looking at him with real anger, and not for the first time he wondered how it was that children begin life so dependent on their parents, and before a decade goes by, they outwardly loathe their creators. That really was the biggest question he had for God, should he ever meet up with the Creator. Thomas stood up, stretched, and breathed in a deep draught of clean air. He let it out slowly, relishing the crispness and the tang of burning wood, a scent that always made him think of forests in autumn, the limbs of the trees adorned with leaves painted in a splashy menagerie of a madman's canvas. He decided to try, one last time, to reach his children. Don't either of you like it out here? The air is so clean you can feel it energize you with each breath. The leaves are so brilliant and diverse that no trees look alike. The water down there is teeming with fish, and when the sun rises and reflects its brilliance off the water and they leap for the joy of it. Look up into the sky. There's nothing, no lights, no pollution, no anything between you and all those stars, between you and the splendor of the universe. Doesn't any of it grab you inside? Doesn't any of this mean anything to either of you? He looked at both of them, and before they even reacted, he realized it was too much, too far beyond their grasp. Sophie rolled her eyes and sat back down, warming her hands in the fire with a sullen, resentful look on her face. Thomas looked to his son, looked deeply into his eyes, but there was no spark there either. No joy, not a hint of all the things that still gave Thomas's life some deep magical meaning was shared there. Dad, Jonathan says, sounding like he was talking to a child himself rather than the 45-year-old man that had brought him into this world. I know you and Grandpa used to come here and he would tell you stories and you would fish and it was great and everything, but that isn't what kids do anymore. I mean, didn't TV stink when you were a kid? No games, no phones, no internet. Most of the things you tell me about being a kid when you were a kid sounds awful. If you could watch Lord of the Rings on a big screen in a nice heated house when you were our age, wouldn't you rather be doing that than sitting out in the woods? The answer was right there behind his lips, a resounding, "Of course not!" But he bit it back, leaving the sentiment unspoken. It was no use. Thomas sat down heavily and buried his face in his hands. They just didn't get it. The generation gap was just too abysmally wide. "Okay," he said, utterly defeated. "First thing in the morning, we can go back to the car and head home. I'm sorry for dragging you out here." His son at least had the good sense to look a little ashamed, but said nothing. His sister, meanwhile, simply raised her hands to the starry skies she cared nothing for and let out a woohoo of triumph. Thomas simply knew when to declare defeat and reached behind his back and into the supply bag, pulling out marshmallows, chocolate, and graham crackers. Cinnamon ones for Jonathan, plain for him and Sophie. She let out another of her warrior hoots, this one a pleasure, and raced to him. He finally did something right for the first time on this miserable day. He smiled at her as she stuck her treat into the flames and retrieved it almost immediately, bathed in flames, and helped her extinguish it with deep breaths before standing another for her and watching her carefully dip it near but not in the flames. Moments like this, where they function as a loving family without all the strife and arguments, made the rest worthwhile. Finally, now that the promise of a speedy retreat from this place, did they settle down and have fun here. It was sad, but trying to bend his kids into liking the same things he did was kind of arrogant and destined to failure. He knew this whole time, yet he gave the attempt anyway. He brought them here for the same reason that he was bringing them back, for love. Love for his grandfather brought him here, just as the love of these kids brought him to the sad truth that he needed to give up on the trip. They may not give a damn about their heritage, but they were still damn good kids, and he still feels love swell in his chest to bursting at times like these. Quiet times are good for remembering why you had kids in the first place. It wasn't about creating tiny versions of yourself, but watching in awe as they blossomed into their own place in this world. No amount of disconnect or annoyance could ever sever the bond between parent and child, and that was a very good thing. This is a peaceful moment, a blissful one. Peace and bliss evaporated in an instant when they all heard something large moving through the woods towards them. Whatever it was, it snapped a branch beneath its feet as it shambled towards their campsite. Thomas was up in an instant, reaching for his rifle. It was not loaded. He would never have a loaded weapon with the kids around unless in an absolute emergency, but his hands were well trained and did the job quickly and efficiently. He snapped the hound thing up and brought the barrel about halfway between the ground and the spot where the sounds were emanating from in the darkness beyond the light of the fire. He did not intend to fire at any living thing, but a warning shot should be enough to scare away any unwanted animal that was curious about them. His children huddled together like storybook children of old, their eyes comically wide and their mouths drawn down in twin rictuses of terror. Sophie was clinging to her brother in a way she hadn't since she had hit her teens and decided that her brother was yucky. The woods were shaking now, and the thing within them shambled ever closer. Thomas stood rigid, ready to snap the rifle up at a second's notice. He would not shoot unless he absolutely must, but his body language spoke volumes. He was tight as a spring. A panting had joined the noises of the advancing thing, wheezing that sounded almost sickly, and Thomas had an instant to worry about some animal being rabid before they could see that the branch was being moved out of the way, just in the gloaming where the darkness swallows the last of the light of their fire. Whatever the thing was, it was almost in sight. Thomas's fingers squeezed the trigger, but he stood firm. He was ready for anything. It is amazing what tricks the eye can play. Thomas at first sees only a misshapen thing as the first flickering lights of... Fuck me sideways. It is amazing what tricks the eye can play. Thomas at first sees only a misshapen thing as the first flickering rays of light strike their unwanted visitor, a thing with a vast head and the lean body of a bipedal animal. Even as his eyes register this, though, he blinks and sees that it is in reality an elderly woman in a long and beaten black shawl. She was very old, maybe as old as 90, and there was a dried riverbed of wrinkles in her wizened face that framed dark eyes that gleamed from the hollows in her socks. She walked with a decided limp, and her back was arched in an exaggerated hump that forced her to lean almost completely on an old walking stick to maintain her balance. A collection of weather-beaten shawls draped from her wasted shoulders, their collective weight seeming to drag her head down with each step she took, and from one hand dangled a hand-woven basket filled with plants. Her eyes lit first upon the fire, and then she seemed to see Thomas and his children. She raised a hand in salute or warning before speaking, a hand that was worn as the logs they had been sitting on around the fire. Her voice was a croak, but she hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Please," she said, "do not shoot." For a second Thomas was puzzled, then he realized he had raised his weapon a little. He put the safety on and placed the weapon on the ground before speaking. Her voice was guttural, as if English was not her first language, and her appearance was absolutely bizarre, but he didn't think she was dangerous. Even if she was, he was pretty confident he could outmatch her in strength, given her condition. "I am so sorry," he he said, walking towards her with arms spread wide to show how harmless he really was. We thought you were a bear. Right, kids? He turned and looked at his children, then had to suppress a laugh. The children were still huddled together, arms locked around each other like tandem skydivers. It seemed to them that she was just as bad as a bear, maybe worse. I am no bear, children, the old woman croaked. Just a foolish old woman who lost track of time and let the sun set on her. Would you mind if I sit by your fire for a bit? Thomas gestured to the logs they had been sitting on and backed away, giving her a direct path to the spot across from the fire from his children. Better safe than sorry. She ambled over very slowly and settled herself on the spacious log with an almost painfully slow crouch. As her backside touched the wood and her weight was off her feet, she let out a contented sigh. If you need one, I can run back to my car and grab you a folding chair, Thomas said. It's no trouble. No, I'm fine on the wood, she said, taking a handful of the fresh dirt at her feet and bringing it up to her nose and inhaling deeply. She turned her face to the fire and smiled, multiplying the wrinkles of her face into dizzying and incalculable numbers. Thomas sat back onto the log next to his kids, who were still locked together, even if their expressions had softened, and gave her a moment. It was obvious from her outfit that she was Indian, and that she had called these woods home. He had millions of questions for her. After all, she had been a part of these woods for a long time. Long before cell phones, Game Boys, hell, even televisions. This woman had been here. She waved her hands to the fire and let out a long coo of pleasure, which displayed surprisingly even white teeth. You have my thanks, kind sir, she said in a strengthening voice, her speech losing its Neanderthal edge and smoothing out a little as her tongue got used to this form of communication, and the vocal cords warmed up from long disuse. I was out checking for berries and such and lost track of the sun. Must be losing my mind. She evidently found this thought entertaining, because she let out a loud cackle at it. The children looked at each other, still clinging to one another tightly, and then both stared at their father. Their expressions questioned his sanity at allowing this whole thing to transpire. The old woman removed one of the shawls from her head, and her long mane of gray hair shook like a spring waterfall in the light of the fire. Thomas was fascinated, but then noticed his children were still clutching each other in terror. Clearly the woman's charm was not universal. I am a diva, the old woman said. And you are? Thomas Dearborn, ma'am, he responded after a brief moment when he inexplicably had to think of his own name. His mind was so full of questions he had temporarily flummoxed when faced with one from her. There was a glamour about this woman which he was having trouble getting a grip on. It was something in the eyes, or the smile, or maybe just her aura, subtle yet undeniable. Are you then? She asked. I'm sorry? Born of a deer, she asked. There was a beat of silence, and the old woman let out another cackle at her own brilliant humor, slapping her knee in glee at her own cleverness. Sophie and Jonathan exchanged another glance at this, having never thought about the origins of their own surnames. Thomas let out a bark of laughter before going on. This is Jonathan and Sophie, he gestured to each, and my parents were just normal folks, just people. People are not so bad a thing to be, she said with an air of a sage divulging the secrets of the universe. His children exchanged yet another glance, but relaxed some, and Sophie stifled a giggle behind her hand, breaking the ring of arms they had shielded themselves behind. So what brings a young man and his children to this spot? Adiva asked. Surely you are out here hunting for old women. That thought brought another withered cackle. No, ma'am, Thomas said. I brought my children out here to try and show them some of their heritage, some sense of wonder for the land, like my grandfather did for me when I was their age. Oh, she said, her eyes glinting and a wry smile dancing at her ancient lips, showing she was clearly intrigued. How has that been working out for you? Thomas looked at his children, and they looked back. He saw their fear had evaporated, but no wonder had replaced it. He was finally resigned to the fact that his kids belonged to that most wretched of tribes, suburbanites. Not well, he said. It's a different time, a different age. I can't force them to see the world through my eyes. Yes, Adiva nodded. Times are so different. The tales of our people are so far removed from what they can even consider life these days. The culture heroes of old cannot hold a candle to Luke Skywalker. You're a Star Wars fan? Thomas spat out in utter belief. No, sir, but I sat in a dark theater. She said theater like they did before movies had sound. Theater. And watched that with my own son. It was many seasons ago, just as it had been many seasons since the last time I set foot into that world. The world of bright lights and fast cars and noisy, rude people. Thomas felt a twinge of unease at that. Like it or not, he was a part of that world, and she didn't seem to like it too much. You've lived here in the woods for a long time, then? Oh, yes, I have. I tried to live there in the world of the conquerors, but I didn't last too long. I did so for a time for the sake of my child, because isolation is not good for children, and their father died young. Eventually, once he found his place in the world, I found that I could not. I could no longer bear what the White Eyes were doing to our land, our people, and our memory. I have had little contact with the outside world since then, since my own son abandoned me and his heritage alike, but what I have seen and heard has only reaffirmed my desire to stay away. A long and uncomfortable silence greeted this, and for a while they all sat and stared at the fire. I will help you, Thomas Dearborn, the diva said suddenly, making all three of them jump. For showing kindness to an old woman in need. Kindness is a rare and precious gift in this world. You don't need to do anything, ma'am, he said. I was happy to help. No, she said. Allow me this small indulgence. Let me tell you a tale of a culture hero of the modern age. Tell me, have you heard of Ravenwolf and the Wytiko? No, Thomas said. I can't say that I have. Then let me tell you their tale. Perhaps it can keep your young ones entertained for a spell. And I so rarely get to speak with people, especially those of our people. This happened just a few years ago, and perhaps this tale in particular might spark some interest in the little ones about the magic and bravery of our people, perhaps rekindle the fires of their ancestors. She sat in the glowing light of the pleasant fire and drew in a great breath, holding it for a long time before expelling it with the first words of her tale. Thomas felt that sense of enchantment, and so his children this time shared it as she began to spin her yarn into the night. Her words danced from her lips in the glow of the flames, and formed visions and nightmares, and maybe even that most elusive of emotions, hope. This tale of heroism and tragedy begins in a prison of absolute darkness, she began.